In this Baldur's Gate 3 multiclassing video, we're going to be taking a look at Fighter Multiclassing and how Fighter stacks up with other classes. We're going to go through each of the classes and kind of break down at like what levels you might take. Keep in mind that this is predominantly from a Fighter point of view that we're going to be doing this if you're going to be taking the majority of your levels of Fighter. If you're taking just a couple levels in Fighter, you'll find those multiclassing tips in the other class videos because that's where you would find that. However, before we get into the multiclassing itself, let's just talk about how good Fighter is at multiclassing. It's arguably the best all-around multiclassing class in Baldur's Gate 3, and one could make the argument that maybe Warlock is as good or better because its extra attack with Pact of the Blade stacks with martial classes, allowing you to get 3 attacks with, lots of different multiclasses. But I think Fighter in general offers more all-around bonuses no matter what multiclass you're doing. For instance, if you take one level of Fighter first, you gain heavy armor, medium armor, light armor, shield, all weapon proficiencies, and you gain Constitution saving throw proficiencies, which apply to concentration as well. So if you're playing a hybrid spellcaster that uses concentration spells, that's really beneficial. You also gain a fighting style 1 level and second wind, so 1 level of Fighter is huge on any build, really. But I think the thing that really pushes it over the top, in my opinion, is the fact that it gains its second feat at level 6. This allows you to take 6 levels of Fighter and, 4 or more levels of another class and still gain 3 feats. And in most cases, most multi-class builds, you'd have to go like 8 and 4 in order to maintain that 3 feats that you want. With Fighter, you can go 6 and 6, or 6, 4 and 2, or 6, 5 and 1, and still have those 3 feats. And that's huge in my opinion, because sometimes going 6 levels into another class allows you to get some really powerful subclass features from those classes, and you'll still maintain those 3 feats. So let's take a look at Barbarian Fighter first, and this is a great multi-class in my opinion. There's a lot of things Barbarian can offer Fighter. Rage, increasing damage to their melee attacks is great. Giving them damage resistance is really nice. Getting Reckless Attack to have advantage on their melee attacks is great. Barbs have really strong subclasses at level 3, so gaining some subclass features like if you're taking Berserk or getting an extra attack, your bonus action there is not bad. The other subclasses are also really strong. So there's a lot of things that I think work really well here between these two classes. And the only thing that I don't think synergizes particularly great is unarmored defense, because I think if you're playing a Fighter predominantly, you're probably not going to be playing unarmored. So let's take a look at 11 Fighter, 1 Barbarian first. There is a case to do this if you want to pick up Rage to gain some more melee damage and to also gain some damage resistance. You do lose your 4th feat by doing this, but you still are able to maintain that extra attack, so you'd have 3 attacks per turn because you still have 11 levels of Fighter. So this is a really good spot in my opinion, and just gaining that Rage and I don't think you're going to use unarmored defense as I mentioned, but getting that Rage for the damage resistance and extra damage can be quite nice. And then if you go 10 Fighter 2 Barbarian, you're going to pick up Reckless Attack, which allows you to have advantage in exchange for enemies having advantage against you, which is fine. You're going to pick up Danger Sense, which is not terrible, and you will lose a second extra attack to do this though, and this is kind of bad, right? Like that second extra attack on Fighter at level 11 is huge, and losing it for these is maybe not enough reason to justify this. I think you'd be better off staying at 11 or just going deeper into Barbarian in general. So then at 9 Fighter 3 Barbarian, you're going to gain a Barbarian subclass, and in exchange, you're going to lose a Fighter subclass feature, and what subclass feature you lose really depends on what class you went. Losing out on an advanced superiority die, that going up to D10 on Battlemaster is kind of a bad loss. Could be made up for by the Barbarian subclass, so that might be a wash. Eldritch Knights, I don't think is that great at level 10, so, taking a level of Barbarian, or 3 levels of Barbarian is probably a good trade on Eldritch Knight. And then, losing a fighting style on Champion, gaining subclass features probably also a wash depending on what you're picking up. And one thing I also want to mention here is that Eldritch Knight and, Barbarian may not necessarily synergize the best, simply because Barbarians can't use spells or concentrate on spells when they're raging. So unless you're picking Eldritch Knight spells that you can like buff yourself with outside of combat, or maybe you toss a spell on the first turn of combat and then, you go into melee, it might be a bad synergy. Like you can absolutely work around it because Eldritch Knights are not usually like the most offensive fighters ever with their spells, but it does take a little bit more managing. And then at 8 levels of Fighter for Barbarian, you're going to gain that 4th feat back in exchange for losing Indomitable. And this is a good trade. Indomitable can only be used once per long rest, so that's not very much at all. Like that's almost useless. It's not completely useless, but a 4th feat would use it constantly probably. So if you're talking about like a breakpoint for Fighter, like 8 Fighter is a really, really good breakpoint over like 9, for instance. A lot of classes, 9 and 3 is a really good spot if you're going to multi-class, but Fighter is actually better at 8 and 4 because they really don't lose much. So then at 7 Fighter, 5 Barbarian, you gain an extra attack from Barbarian that does not stack with Fighter, so that's essentially nothing. You gain fast movement, which increases your movement distance. You're not wearing heavy armor, but you lose a feat for that. I don't think that's a good trade. I would not recommend going 7 Fighter, 5 Barbarian. And then at 6 Fighter, 6 Barbarian, you gain a Barbarian subclass feature, but you lose a Fighter subclass feature. So this is obviously really going to depend on like what your subclass feature you're gaining and what you're losing. And that's kind of really dependent on, what you've gone here. So that could go either way. But I would just say that 8 and 4 seems to be the best breakpoint between Fighter Barbarian, unless there's a specific subclass feature from Barbarian that you want at level 6, and you don't lose anything bad or too bad from Fighter to gain it. So next, let's take a look at Bard Fighter Multiclassing. And this is actually not a bad multiclass. And one of the things I realized about Bard as I've been doing these multiclassing videos is that Bard is a fantastic class to multiclass, because it's so front-loaded. It gains so many things between levels 2 and 5 that other classes typically don't get. And there are just so many useful things here that, like, I think you can multi-class Bard with just about any class in this game, and you would probably be fine. So let's take a look at 10 Fighter, 2 Bard first, because I don't think you would go 1 level of Bard. Like, you need at least 2 levels of Bard to, I think, really justify even going into Bard. Here you're going to pick up Bard level 1 spells and slots, cantrips, Bardic Inspiration, which is great, Song of Rest, so you can short rest one more time, and Jack of all trades to get some more, better skill interactions. And in exchange, you're going to lose a 4th feat and 2nd extra attack from Fighter. That's a tough trade, in my opinion. You'd have more utility as a Fighter with this trade-off, and you'd probably, be able to benefit your team with Bardic Inspiration, but that extra attack that you're going to lose and another feat that you're going to lose probably comes out a bit behind in general. So if you're going to go Bard, I think going more levels in Bard is better, or just sticking with at least 11 Fighter levels. And then at 9 Fighter, 3 Bard, you gain Bard level 2 spells and slots, you gain a Bard subclass, and you gain expertise and 2 skills in exchange for losing a Fighter subclass feature. And again, what you lose at level 10 here really depends on what subclass you are. Some are better than others. But I would just say that if you're going to go 9 Fighter and 3 Bard, like College of Valor is kind of useless with a Fighter multiclass, so I wouldn't suggest that. Swords is a bit better than Valor because it has, things you can spend your Bardic Inspiration die on that help a Fighter in combat. And then College of Lore is also really good with Fighter, but I would not go College of Valor if you're going to go, a multi-class with Fighter. And then at 8 Fighter, 4 Bard, you gain that 4th feat back, you gain another spell slot and a cantrip from Bard, and you lose Indomitable. This is great, in my opinion. If you're going to go 9 Fighter, 3 Bard, go 8 Fighter, 4 Bard. It's even better. And then at 7 Fighter, 5 Bard, you gain Bard level 3 spells and slots. You gain Font of Inspiration, which allows you to recharge your Bardic Inspiration on short rest as well as long rest, which is huge. And your Bardic Inspiration becomes a 1d8 instead of 1d6 in exchange for losing a feat. This is probably a really good trade, in my opinion. Like, I think you're already going to have 3 feats anyway, which I think is enough for this build. Gaining those extra spells and spell slots and, the fact you can recharge your Bardic Inspiration on short rest. Maybe you're playing a Battle Master that also gets its stuff back on short rest. Being able to rest extra with Song of Rest. Very good synergy there. And then at 6 Fighter, 6 Bard, you gain a Bard subclass feature and another level 3 spell slot and lose a Fighter subclass feature to gain this. So it really depends on what you're gaining here. For instance, College of Valor and College of Swords both gain an extra attack that doesn't stack with Fighter here. So there's no real reason to go 6 Bard if you're playing one of those subclasses with a Fighter, which you shouldn't be doing Valor anyway, but Swords, if you went Swords, you probably would stop at 7 and 5, and, you wouldn't go any lower or higher into Bard, rather, because it just doesn't make any sense to just waste that, particularly to lose a subclass feature from Fighter. But College of Lore is really good here. Getting extra magical secrets is really nice, and depending on what you're losing from your subclass in Fighter, that might be worth a trade. So next, let's take a look at Fighter Cleric Multiclass, and again, this is another decent one. Fighter's multiclass really well with spellcasters. And, picking up some of the things that clerics can give them, like, Bless or something like that can further boost their attacks, or, other offensive spells that they can use in common, or even some defensive spells like Sanctuary are really nice. If you want some more utility on your Fighter, Cleric is not a bad option. So for Cleric, we're going to start at 10 Fighter, 2 Cleric for similar reasons to Bard, because I don't think you would take 1 level of Cleric. You just don't gain enough from it to really justify it. I mean, you could if you really wanted. But I think if you're going to go Cleric, you're going to have at least 2 levels of Cleric, and that's because here you'll gain Cleric cantrips, level 1 spells and slots, their Channel Divinity, the subclass feature, whatever domain you chose, Turn Undead, and you'll lose your 4th feat here, and you'll lose the 2nd extra attack that fighter gains. That's a tough trade in my opinion, unless you have a really particular build that really needs something from Cleric to, like, with an item combination, then losing out on that 2nd extra attack and feat is probably not worth it. So I think if you're going to go Fighter Cleric, you'll probably go more levels into Fighter and Cleric. More levels into Cleric, rather, and less levels in Fighter in order to justify that. A lot of multi-classes with Clerics will take like 1 level of Cleric, usually to pick up the subclass feature and also to pick up some weapon and armor proficiencies that some Cleric subclasses provide. But since Fighter already has those armor and weapon proficiencies, it's not as good on a Fighter. And then at 9 Fighter 3 Cleric, you gain Cleric level 2 spells and slots along with domain spells or whatever domain you chose, and in exchange you'll lose a Fighter subclass. This is probably worth the trade most of the time, depending on what subclass feature you lost, but picking up those level 2 spells can be really, really beneficial. And then at 8 Fighter 4 Cleric, you gain another Cleric cantrip, another level 2 spell slot, and you gain your 4th feat back, and you lose Indomitable. This is a great trade. If you're going to go 9 and 3 Cleric, you might as well go 8 and 4 Cleric. At 7 Fighter 5 Cleric, you gain Cleric level 3 spells and slots in the domain spells of that domain, along with Destroy Undead for losing a feat. If you're trying to be a hybrid Fighter Cleric and you want to dive more into spellcasting, then you'll definitely want to go at least this far. If you're trying to remain predominantly a Fighter and you just want some utility from Cleric, then 8 and 4 would be better. And then at 6 Fighter 6 Cleric, you'll gain another level 3 spell slot and a Cleric subclass feature in exchange for losing a subclass feature from Fighter. And again, this really depends on what subclass feature you're gaining from Cleric, depending on what domain you chose and what Fighter subclass feature you're losing. So that's really just going to have to really compare those two things to see. Otherwise, 7 and 5 is pretty good. So next, let's take a look at Druid Fighter Multiclassing. And this works fine as a multiclass, again, because Fighter is so versatile. I would say that it's probably not as synergetic as some of the other spellcasting classes, simply because Circle of the Moon Druids basically have to take levels in Circle of the Moon in order to get more effective while they're wild shaped. So if you're planning on being in wild shape predominantly in combat, then you'll probably just want to take like Circle of the Moon Druid like all the way up or pretty close to it. You're not going to want to split your levels with Fighter, so that means Fighter's predominantly going to multi-class with, you know, either Circle of the Land or Circle of the Spores, and it's not really going to multi-class much with Circle of the Moon. But what I do really love about Fighter Druid as a combo is that if you do use Wild Shape and, you know, either of the two other subclasses, which you might from time to time, you know, a lot of the feats that you can gain are still effective while you're Wild Shaped. And you have to look at the Wild Shape page on the wiki to see which ones are effective. A lot of them are effective while you're Wild Shaped. So by being able to take a lot of feats as a fighter, because you get that extra one at level 6, that can really benefit you if you're planning on playing in Wild Shape. Admittedly, if you're planning on fighting in Wild Shape constantly, you know, you'd be better off just going Circle of the Moon Druid probably. So let's take a look at 10 and 2 first. At 10 Fighter 2 Druid, you gain Druid cantrips, Druid level 1 spells and slots, a Druid subclass feature depending on which Druid subclass you chose. You gain Wild Shape, and you lose a 4th feat and a 2nd extra attack. And this is probably not better than just 12 Fighter at this point. It's, again, just like the other classes I mentioned previously. It's kind of like if you're going to go Druid Fighter Multiclass, you probably want to go a little bit deeper into Druid than just 2 levels. You could stop here, but I think you should probably go further. And then at 9 Fighter 3 Druid, you gain Druid level 2 spells and slots, and you gain subclass spells. If you went Circle of the Land or Circle of the Spores, you'll gain some extra spells here in exchange for losing a fighter subclass feature. If you want more utility, this is probably a good trade. And I think if I was going to go Fighter Druid, I would go at least 9 Fighter 3 Druid. And 8 Fighter 4 Druid, you gain another Druid cantrip, another spell slot for level 2. You gain Wild Shape Deep Wrathy as a form if you're going to Wild Shape, and a feat in exchanging for losing Indomitable. This is a no-brainer. You're going to go 9 and 3 Druid, go 8 and 4. And then at 7 Fighter 5 Druid, you gain access to Druid level 3 spells and slots. You gain Wild Strike, which allows you to attack an extra attack if you're Wild Shaped. You will also gain more circle spells, depending on, you know, if you want Spores or Land, in exchange for losing a feat. I think this is a good trade. Unless you're playing, like, just, again, kind of like a utility from your Druid, that's what all you really want. You still want to be predominantly a fighter. 7 and 5 is really good in my opinion. And then at 6 Fighter 6 Druid, you gain a Druid subclass feature, you gain a level 3 spell slot, you gain Wild Shape Panther and Owlbear in exchange for losing a fighter subclass. I think this is a better trade-off more often than not. It's definitely much better on Circle of Spores Druid, because you gain some great things at level 6 here, compared to what you gain for Circle of the Land. So if you're going Circle of the Land, I might stop at 7 and 5, although, you know, getting the extra Wild Shapes might be beneficial to you, so that's not so bad. But 6 and 6 is definitely fine, especially if you're playing Circle of Spores. Up next, we'll take a look at Fighter Monk Multiclass. This is a fantastic multiclass in my opinion. You can gain a lot of things on your fighter, like being able to use your bonus action to use like Flurry of Blows or Unarmed Attack, so that you can gain some extra damage with that bonus action every turn if you want. Also, because you can gain like martial arts dexterous attacks, allowing you to use your dexterity to on different weapons that you wouldn't normally be able to use them on. You can make a nice dexterity fighter monk that, you know, focuses on dexterity but has a lot broader range of weapons that it can use. So first, let's take a look at 11 fighter 1 monk. And what you would gain here is you gain some ki, you gain 2 ki, you gain Flurry of Blows, which you can use with your bonus action. You gain unarmored defense, which I don't think you're really going to use with a fighter. And you would gain martial arts, as I mentioned. Dexterous attacks allows you to use dexterity. You would be able to use a bonus action to make an unarmed attack every turn if you want. And your unarmed attacks would deal a little bit more damage in exchange for losing a 4th feat. I think this is a fair trade in my opinion, because you probably don't need a 4th feat on this multiclass. I mean, who doesn't like more feats? But you don't necessarily have to have 4 on this build. And then at 10 Fighter 2 Monk, you're going to gain another ki. You will gain Unarmored Movement, which is not probably helpful. You'll probably be using armor on this build, although you don't necessarily have to, particularly if you went Dexterity. You could have a lot of Dexterity with this build, like up to 20 Dexterity probably. So you could actually go Unarmored, which would give you, you know, extra movement speed. Step of the Wind is really nice to spend your ki on to be able to dash or disengage as a bonus action. And Patient Defense makes you harder to hit for a ki, which is great. In exchange for losing a 2nd extra attack, though, I don't know if it's worth it necessarily. I think I would go deeper into Monk. I would either go 1 level of Monk to get the things I mentioned before, or I'd go deeper into Monk to gain more things. At 9 Fighter 3 Monk, you gain another ki. You gain Deflect Missiles, which is based off Dexterity, so this is particularly good if you're playing a Dexterity Monk. You gain Increased Unarmed Damage, which is great if you're using your Flurry of Blows and Unarmed Attack, which you probably will. And you'll also gain a Monk subclass, which is great in exchange for looting a Fighter subclass. I think this is a good trade in my opinion. I would go at least 9 Fighter 3 Monk if you're not going 11 and 1. And as always, if you go 8 Fighter and 4 Monk, you're going to gain another ki, and you'll also gain Slowfall, but more importantly, you gain that feat back in exchange for losing Indomitable, which is a great trade in my opinion. So if you're going to go 9 and 3, go 8 and 4 instead. And then at 7 Fighter, 5 Monk, you gain another ki. You gain an extra attack that doesn't stack with Fighter, so that's kind of null. But you do gain Stunning Strike, allowing you to try and stun using ki every time you attack, which is great as long as you have the ki for it, and that can help prevent a lot of damage against you, which is really nice, in exchange for losing a feat. I think it really depends on how you're building your fighter. This could be a wash most of the time, or it could be better if Stunning Strike is better than any feat you might take. And then lastly, at 6 Fighter 6 Monk, you gain another ki. You gain Improved Unarmored Movement, so again, if you're unarmored, this could be beneficial to you. You gain Ki Empowered Strikes, which helps you overcome damage resistance sometimes when you're attacking unarmed. And then you gain another subclass feature from Monk in exchange for losing a fighter subclass. I think more often than not, this is going to be a good trade-off, but it's not always, depending on what subclass for Monk that you chose. But for instance, if you took like Wave Shadow, or if you took Wave the Open Hand, this is phenomenal at this level. So definitely recommend 6 Monk, 6 Fighter a lot of the time if you went 7 and 5 already anyway. So next up, let's take a look at Paladin multiclassing with Fighter. This is actually not a bad pairing in my opinion, particularly if you match it with Eldritch Knight in order to gain extra spell slots that you can then use on Divine Smites. And even though Paladins use Charisma for their spell casting and Eldritch Knights use Intelligence, you can take a lot of utility spells that really don't need very high, intelligence or charisma. So you could either focus on one of these stats or focus on neither and still have a strong pairing. So first, let's take a look at 10 Fighter 2 Paladin. I don't think you would go 11 Fighter 1 Paladin just because you gain so much from Paladin at level 2. Here you're going to gain Lay on Hands, Divine Sense, your Channel Oath ability, access to Divine Smite. You'll gain access to level 1 Paladin spells, and you'll have Paladin spell slots, and you'll also gain a second fighting style for this build. And in exchange, you'll lose a 4th feat and a 2nd extra attack. And this is probably a wash, particularly if you went Eldritch Knight, because you will use that Divine Smite a lot. And I do want to mention that 2 Paladin is a really good multi-class with Eldritch Knight, and particularly if you want to try multi-class here, if you took something like Wizard in order to gain even more spell slots. Maybe if you went like 6 Fighter, 4 Wizard, 2 Paladin, that would give you even more spell slots. It would give you roughly 4, 3, 3, and 1. So you'd have level 4 spells. You could learn from scrolls on your Wizard, and you would also have a lot more spell slots to use Divine Smites with, in exchange for not losing too much. I think that's not a bad spot either. If you go 9 Fighter, 3 Paladin, you gain another spell slot, you gain Divine Health, you gain a subclass feature from Paladin and some subclass spells, and you lose a fighter subclass. That's probably a better trade, in my opinion, than simply sticking with 10 and 2, depending on what you're losing exactly. And then at 8 and 4, you're going to gain another Lay on Hands charge, and you'll gain a feat in exchange for losing Indomitable. This is a good trade, in my opinion. If you were planning to go 9 Fighter, 3 Paladin at least, 8 Fighter, 4 Paladin is better. And then at 7 Fighter, 5 Paladin, you gain level 2 Paladin spells and spell slots, and you gain extra attack, which doesn't stack with Fighter, in exchange for losing a feat. And I think if you're going to go, past 8 Fighter, 4 Paladin anyway, you might as well go all the way down to 6 Fighter and 6 Paladin. And that's because you gain Aura of Protection at this level in exchange for losing a Fighter subclass feature, which I think is worth it more often than it's not. And you will actually have level 3 spell slots if you do this as well, which is fantastic. You won't have that at 7 and 5. So you're either going to, in my opinion, you're going to stop at 10 and 2, you're going to go 8 and 4, you're going to go 6 and 6, with 6 and 6 giving you the most spell slots. I think that probably makes the most sense if you're just dual classing it. And next we take a look at Ranger Fighter Multiclass. I don't think this is a great multiclass in my opinion. You get some of the same things that you gain from taking levels of Fighter with Ranger, like a fighting style. You could gain a second fighting style, so you might want that. But there isn't a ton of synergy here. For instance, at level 3 of Ranger, you're going to gain a subclass feature, and like if you say you take Gloomstalker, which gives you like an extra attack at the beginning of combat, you could just take 11 Fighter and you'd have that extra attack every round, which is stronger in my opinion. So there isn't as much synergy here as I think there is with Paladin, but there is some synergy. So if you were going to multi-class, you might go 11 Fighter, 1 Ranger to gain a skill, Favored Enemy, and Natural Explorer, which can also give you skills or damage resistance in exchange for losing a 4th feat. I think this is probably a wash, depending on, what you took with that 4th feat. There are some things that are really good that you could pick up here with just 1 level of Ranger. And then at 10 Fighter, 2 Ranger, you gain another fighting style. You'll gain Ranger level 1 spells and slots in exchange for losing your 2nd extra attack. This is not a good trade. This is a very bad trade. I don't recommend this. If you're going to go Ranger Fighter, I would either go 1 Ranger Fighter or go much deeper into Ranger. And then at 9 Fighter, 3 Ranger, you gain a Ranger subclass and a spell slot for level 1 spells, and you lose a Fighter subclass feature. And again, because you are missing out on that extra attack, this is kind of rough in my opinion, because even if you pick up, like I said, with Gloomstalker, an extra attack at the beginning of each combat, I don't think that's a good trade for an extra attack every round. And if you take something else like Hunter, which is probably the only other subclass you take, because Beastmaster, you're just going to want to go Beastmaster if you're playing a Beastmaster. And if you take Hunter, you can pick up a decent thing here with like Colossus Slayer or something like that, or Hordebreaker. But again, I think extra attack at 11 Fighter still outweighs that. So you would definitely want to come at least this far in Ranger, if not further. Otherwise, you'd still be better off going 11 and 1. So then if you go 8 Fighter, 4 Ranger, you gain a feat, but you lose Indomitable. And this is a better spot, in my opinion. Indomitable is not that good because it only recharges on long rest. So if you were planning on going 9 and 3, you might as well go 8 and 4. And then at 7 Fighter, 5 Ranger, you gain extra attack, which doesn't stack with Fighter, so that's kind of wasted. And you gain level 2 Ranger spells and slots in exchange for losing a feat. You'd have to decide whether those level 2 spell slots and spells are worth losing a feat here, because that's all you're really trading it off. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad trade if you're talking about utility, but it isn't the greatest either. And then at 6 Fighter, 6 Ranger, you gain another Favored Enemy and Natural Explorer, and you lose a Fighter subclass feature for this. And the only reason this makes sense to me is if you went Eldritch Knight, because if you did that, you'd have 4, 3, and 2 spells, meaning you'd have access to level 3 spell slots. Even though you wouldn't have level 3 spells, you could upcast your spells to level 3, which would be nice. But otherwise, you're probably not going to do this. So I think if you're playing a Fighter Ranger, you're either going 11 and 1 with whatever fighter type you want, or you're going 6 Fighter, 6 Ranger with Eldritch Knight. And now we'll take a look at Rogue Fighter Multiclassing. This is a pretty good multiclass in my opinion. You can get a lot of utility from Rogue, and you can still keep your damage rather high from sneak attack. There's so many ways to gain advantage on attacks in this game that, getting that sneak attack every round is not too difficult to do. And if you are playing a Fighter Rogue multiclass, particularly if you're taking a lot of levels in Rogue, and this character is going to be handling like a lot of your lockpicking and sneaking and stuff like that, I would highly recommend that you make this a dexterity-based character, since a lot of those skills rely on dexterity for their skill checks, because finesse weapons can use dexterity, etc. It would just be a natural synergy there. So at 11 fighter, 1 rogue, you're going to gain a skill, you'll gain expertise in 2 skills, and you'll gain sneak attack damage equal to 1 to 6 damage each round in exchange for losing a 4th feat. I think this is a fair trade most of the time, particularly if you're looking to pick up some outside of combat usefulness for your fighter. At 10 fighter, 2 rogue, you gain cunning action, allowing you to hide, disengage, or dash as a bonus action, but you lose your second extra attack. This isn't a good trade. You're either going to want to go 11-1 or you're going to want to go much further into rogue. At 9 fighter, 3 rogue, you gain a rogue subclass. Your sneak attack increases to 2d6 or 2 to 12 damage in exchange for losing a fighter subclass. This is much better than 10 and 2 in my opinion, even though I still think that, 11 and 1 is still better at this point because, that second extra attack is so strong. But, rogues have a lot of good subclasses here. An Arcane Trickster synergizes pretty well with Eldritch Knight if you went that way. Or taking Thief for the bonus action if you're dual wielding can be really, really strong as well. So I definitely think this is better than 10 and 2, but I still think 11-1 is better at this point. And then if you go 8 fighter, 4 rogue, you gain a feat, but you lose Indomitable. This is even better than 9 and 3. Indomitable, again, not that great, but that feat is nice. So it still gives you 4 feats, which is quite strong. And then at 7 fighter, 5 rogue, you gain Uncanny Dodge, which is really nice to have because you're probably going to be getting hit. Your sneak attack damage will go up another 1d6 dice in exchange for losing a feat. If you don't mind having only 3 feats on this build for a little extra sneak attack damage and protection, this is a good trade. Otherwise, 8 and 4 is a bit better. And then at level 6 fighter, 6 rogue, you're going to gain expertise in 2 skills for losing a fighter subclass feature. This is probably a slight loss here, depending on what you're losing. Maybe it's something you don't really need. Really depends on what the subclass feature is, if you need that expertise or not. So if I was going to go fighter rogue, I'd either go 11 and 1 with just a quick dip in order to pick up some skills and expertise, etc., or I'd probably go like 8 and 4 in order to pick up like, Thief's bonus action and still have 4 feats. That's a pretty good spot in my opinion. And next we move to Sorcerer Fighter Multiclass, and this is a pretty good multiclass if you want to pick up some spell casting. It's even better if you went Eldritch Knight already. There is a little bit of a conflict. In Eldritch Knights are intelligence-based, Sorcerers are charisma-based. However, you can just pick up utility spells on your, Eldritch Knight spells so that you don't really need to have high intelligence, and you could just focus on charisma. So first, let's take a look at 10 Fighter, 2 Sorcerer. I don't think you would go less Sorcerer levels than this because you just gain so much at Sorcerer level 2. By doing this, you're going to gain Sorcerer subclass feature, level 1 Sorcerer spells and slots, sorcery points, and 2 meta magic in exchange for losing a 4th feat and a second extra attack. And this is kind of rough, in my opinion, because that second extra attack is really strong, but you will have 4 level 1 slots, 3 level 2 slots, and 2 level 1 spell slots, or 2 level 3 spell slots, rather. So you're going to have lots of spells. You won't necessarily have, you'll only have level 2 spells, though, with Fighter, and level 1 with Sorcerer, so you'll be able to upcast them, but you wouldn't have access to level 3 spells exactly. So it's not terrible, but it's not great. And then at 9 Fighter, 3 Sorcerer, you're going to gain level 2 spells and slots from Sorcerer. You're going to gain an extra meta magic, which you can use for Quicken Spell, which is great. You'll get another sorcery point. You lose a Fighter subclass feature, and you'll gain, as I mentioned, an extra spell here. So you'll go 4, 3, and 3 at this point. This is certainly better than 10 and 2 in my opinion, but it's still not great. At 8 Fighter, 4 Sorcerer, you're going to gain a sorcery point, another feat, cantrip, another sorcerer spell in exchange for losing Indomitable. This is even better in my opinion. So if you were thinking 9 and 3, 8 and 4 is better. At 7 Fighter, 5 Sorcerer, you're going to gain level 3 spells and spell slots from Sorcerer, and you'll gain another sorcery point in exchange for losing a feat. And you will also have, if you went Eldritch Knight, you will have access to level 4 spell slot, which is nice. You can upcast those level 3 spells if you want. This is a really good spot in my opinion, and I would consider going at least 7 and 5 if you were going 8 and 4. And then if you go 6 Fighter, 6 Sorcerer, you're going to gain a level 3 spell and spell slot, a sorcery point, and Sorcerer subclass feature in exchange for losing a Fighter subclass feature. And I think if you went Eldritch Knight, this is probably where I would go, 6 and 6. You're going to have 2 level 4 spells at this point if you do that, and that's just really strong. And Sorcerers have really good subclass features at level 6. So this is a really good spot for Fighter Sorcerer in my opinion. So next we take a look at Fighter Warlock Multiclassing. This is a phenomenal multiclass in my opinion because Pact of the Blade stacks with the extra attack of Fighter. You'll be able to get 3 attacks in melee if you do that. Plus you'll have some spell casting ability. It doesn't have as much synergy with Eldritch Knight as some of the other spellcasters because Pact Magic spell slots work a little bit differently. But that extra attack that you gain from Warlock more than makes up for it. However, you could theoretically just go Eldritch Knight and have a lot of similarities with that extra attack, so there is that to consider. So at 10 Fighter 2 Warlock, you gain a subclass feature from the Warlock. You gain 2 level 1 spells and slots. You gain 2 Eldritch Invocations in exchange for losing a 4th feat and 2nd extra attack. Don't think this is a great trade in my opinion. I think I would go much further into Warlock if I was going to go multi-classing with this. At 9 and 3, you're going to gain level 2 spells and slots from the Warlock, as well as a Pact Boon, which would allow you to use Charisma on your melee attacks if you went Pact of the Blade, which would be nice. That way you could focus on Charisma predominantly on your fighter. You don't really need Strength or Dexterity as much. In exchange for losing a fighter subclass, I think if I was going to go Fighter Warlock, I would at least go 9 and 3. At 8 Fighter 4 Warlock, you're going to gain a Cantrip and a Feat in exchange for losing Indomitable. This is even better than 9 and 3. So if you wanted to go 9 and 3, you go 8 and 4. At 7 Fighter 5 Warlock, you're going to gain level 3 spells and slots for your Pact Magic spell slots, and you'll gain 1 Eldritch Invocation, and you'll gain Deep Impact, which allows you to take that extra attack on Pact of the Blade if you want, so you'd have 3 melee attacks at this point, along with, 2 level 3 spells and spell slots for Warlock, which is pretty good in exchange for losing a feat. So if you were planning on going 9 and 3, 8 and 4, etc., 7 and 5, even better. And then at 6 Fighter 6 Warlock, you gain a Warlock subclass feature in exchange for losing a Fighter subclass feature. This is just a wash. Depending on what you gain, this may or may not be better for you, and it's really going to be determined by what subclasses you have. And then lastly, we come to Fighter Wizard Multiclass. And this is a pretty good multiclass because Wizards and Eldritch Knights both use Intelligence for their spell casting. So it makes sense to have high Intelligence on this build as it benefits both of them. Wizards can, learn spells from scrolls. So even if you just dip 1 level into Wizard, it would allow you to learn spells that you wouldn't necessarily have access to on your Eldritch Knight. So there's a really nice synergy between these two classes. So if you take a look at 11 Fighter 1 Wizard, you're going to gain Wizard level 1 spells and slots. You'll gain 1 Arcane Recovery charge, and you can learn spells from scrolls in exchange for losing a 4th feat. This is a really good trade in my opinion. Even though you would still only have level 2 spell slots, you would be able to learn Wizard level 2 spells that you could use with those slots. So that's a really good trade. And then at 10 Fighter 2 Wizard, you're going to gain a Wizard subclass feature and a spell slot in exchange for losing your 2nd extra attack. This could be kind of rough in my opinion at this point because that 2nd extra attack is really strong, and I don't know that you're going to have enough spells at this point to really benefit from that dip. At 9 Fighter 3 Wizard, you gain Wizard level 2 spells and spell slots. You gain an Arcane Recovery charge in exchange for losing a fighter subclass. I think this is a good trade in my opinion. Again, the upside here is that if you go 8 Fighter and 4 Wizard, you're going to have even more spells and you're going to gain 4 feet. So I think, again, if you're going to go 9 Fighter 3 Wizard, you'd probably be better off going 8 Fighter 4 Wizard. You'll have an extra cantrip as well and spell slot. And then at 7 Fighter 5 Wizard, you're going to gain access to level 3 spells and slots for the Wizard. You'll gain another Arcane Recovery charge in exchange for losing a feat. This is really strong in my opinion. If you went Eldritch Knight, you'll have a level 4 spell slot as well that you can upcast spells with, or you'll be able to learn Wizard level 4 spells from scrolls, which is nice. But even better here, 6 Fighter 6 Wizard, you'll have, especially if you went Eldritch Knight, you'll have another level 4 spell slot that you can use, cast spells in exchange for losing a fighter subclass feature. But you'll also gain a Wizard subclass feature, and I think Wizard subclass features at level 6 are even better than Fighter subclass features at this level, typically. So I think if I was going to go 6 Fighter, if I was going to go Fighter Wizard, I would go 6 Fighter 6 Wizard. So that wraps up our video on Fighter Multiclassing. I hope that helped you guys out. I really enjoy doing this series. I learn a lot from doing it, just kind of evaluating, breaking down things. Fighter just lends itself really well to multiclassing, and Eldritch Knight is actually a really strong multiclassing subclass because those spell slots are going to stack with, whatever spellcasting class you get, except for Warlock. So that's very, very strong indeed. So stay tuned for more multiclassing guides. I plan to try and get out at least one every week moving forward, and are going to be doing some Elden Ring content soon, so stay tuned for that.